He had rejected every woman in his kingdom for 6 years. So why did the most feared king alive go completely still when a human nobody slapped him? The crack of her palm against his jaw killed every sound in the grand mating hall instantly. Chloe Wren stood exactly where she had no business standing. Hand still raised, gold braid unraveling wild around her shoulders, borrowed gown trembling at the hem. She was a seamstress's apprentice from Ashwick, a border village so insignificant that half the wolves in this hall had never heard its name. She had not come here for a king. She had come to free her mistress from a false accusation and go home before nightfall. Instead, she had just slapped the Alpha King of Dravenholm across the face in front of 500 witnesses. Brondon Vile did not move, did not roar, did not reach for her throat the way every instinct in that hall screamed he should. The man who had ended wars with a single command stood perfectly, terrifyingly still. His long black hair swept across his jaw from the force of the blow, his dark armor catching the candlelight, his eyes finding her face with an expression that shattered 6 years of cold indifference into pieces. Not fury, not humiliation, recognition. Guards drew silver blades. Noble women choked on gasps. The entire court braced for the execution that always followed disobedience. Instead, Brondon took one slow step toward her and spoke in a voice so quiet the whole room leaned forward to catch it. Who told a human girl she could touch her king? The hall erupted into chaos. Because Chloe Wren, nobody, border girl, accidental intruder, had just been claimed as mate by the most powerful wolf alive, and she had no idea what that was going to cost her. Chapter 1 is coming, and nothing goes the way she expects. If this already has you hooked, you haven't seen anything yet. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and be the first to see. Chapter 1. The moment it drops. The Alpha King has waited 6 years for his mate. She just slapped him. Now he'll burn the world before he lets her go. Don't miss it. Chapter 1. The morning Chloe Wren's life fell apart began the way every good morning in Ashwick did. With the smell of beeswax, the soft pull of thread through linen, and Elena humming something tuneless and warm from the back of the shop. It was the kind of morning that made you believe nothing bad could reach you here. Chloe had believed that for 19 years. She should have known better. Elena's shop sat at the crooked end of Ashwick's main road, a small leaning building with gold-painted letters above the door that had been fading since before Chloe was born. Inside, bolts of fabric lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Wool the color of winter bark, silk the pale blush of early dawn, linen in every shade of cream and ivory and bone. Chloe knew every bolt by touch. She had spent her entire life in these walls. First as an orphaned child, Elena had taken in without hesitation. Then as an apprentice. Then as something closer to a daughter than either of them had ever said out loud. She was halfway through hemming a wedding order when the door opened without a knock. 3 of them, royal soldiers in black and silver, boots tracking mud across Elena's clean floor, hands resting on their sword hilts with the lazy confidence of men who had never once been told no. The one in front, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like a cliff face and eyes that held nothing resembling warmth, pulled a rolled document from his coat and held it out without looking at either of them directly. As though they were furniture, as though this shop and everything in it was already his to dispose of. Elena Marsh, he said flatly. Seamstress. You are accused of theft of royal fabric, specifically 14 yards of silver ceremonial cloth commissioned for the crown and never delivered. Elena went white. Chloe set down her needle. "That's incorrect," Chloe said. The soldier's eyes moved to her slowly, the way a man looks at something he finds mildly irritating. "I beg your pardon?" "I said that's incorrect." Chloe stood, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. "Elena delivered that order 6 weeks ago. I packed it myself. There are receipts, signed receipts, from the palace receiving officer, dated and stamped. Would you like me to get them, or are you planning to ignore those too?" The silence in the shop stretched tight. Elena's hand found Chloe's wrist beneath the work table, a quiet, desperate pressure that said, "Please, stop, it isn't worth it." Chloe did not stop. The soldier in front smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had been given a job to do and found the resistance entertaining rather than concerning. "The palace has no record of any such delivery," he said simply. "Then the palace lost it? Or the seamstress stole it? Or," Chloe said, her voice dropping to something very quiet and very clear, "someone in that palace decided it was easier to accuse an old woman in a border village than to admit they misplaced 14 yards of cloth. Which of those do you think is more likely?" Nobody moved. Elena made a small, frightened sound. The 2 soldiers behind their leader exchanged a glance, and the man in front looked at Chloe for a long, measuring moment, reassessing, recalculating, before he tucked the document back into his coat with a smile that had gone very thin. "Here is what happens next," he said pleasantly. "The accused will travel to Dravenholm to answer these charges before the crown directly. She will present herself at the palace within 4 days." He paused. "Alternatively, we can settle the matter of the stolen goods right now by seizing assets of equivalent value." His eyes moved around the shop, the fabric, the tools, the fading gold letters above the door, the building itself. Chloe felt the blood leave her face. Elena made a sound like something breaking quietly. "She's 63 years old," Chloe said, her voice no longer quite steady. "She cannot make that journey alone. The road to Dravenholm takes 4 days on foot and she—" "Then perhaps," the soldier said, already turning for the door, "you should go with her." He left. His men followed. The door swung shut behind them, and the little gold bell above it rang once, cheerful and absurd, and completely wrong for the moment. The shop was very quiet. Elena sat down heavily on her stool, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the middle distance with the look of a woman doing rapid, terrible calculations about the life she had built and how quickly it could be taken. Chloe stood at the window and watched the soldiers mount their horses and ride north without looking back. She thought about the receipts in the drawer, signed, stamped, absolutely real and absolutely meaningless against men who had already decided what the truth was. She picked up her coat. "Pack lightly," she told Elena quietly. "I'll handle Dravenholm." She had absolutely no idea what Dravenholm was about to do to her. Chapter 2. Chloe had never seen a city before. She had imagined one, the way people who have only ever known small things imagine large ones, assembled from fragments of description and the occasional traveling merchant's boast. She had pictured Dravenholm as Ashwick, but bigger. More roads, more buildings, more people. She had been spectacularly wrong. Dravenholm did not feel like a city. It felt like a force of nature that had decided, at some point in the distant past, to hold still long enough for people to build inside it. It rose from the valley floor in layers, gray stone and silver spire, bridge over river, market stacked against temple stacked against wall. And at its highest point, visible from every angle and every distance, the royal palace caught the afternoon light and threw it back like a warning. Chloe stood at the city's outer gate with Elena's hand in hers and felt, for the first time in her life, genuinely small. The streets were chaos. Not the comfortable, familiar chaos of a market day. This was something pressurized, something electric, something that moved through the crowd the way a current moves through water. Banners she didn't recognize hung from every window, silver and black, snapping in a wind that smelled like cold iron and pine. Wolves moved through the streets the way storm clouds move, not hurrying exactly, but with a weight to them, a gravity that made the human traders and servants around them unconsciously step aside. Their eyes were sharper than they should have been. Their voices carried lower than the noise around them warranted. A woman selling bread near the gate leaned toward her neighbor and spoke in a rapid, hushed voice that Chloe caught only pieces of. 6th year, still no queen, they say he dismissed. 4 of them before noon. Chloe filed that away and kept moving. She found an inn 2 streets from the gate, narrow, slightly crooked, with the particular smell of establishments that charged reasonable prices and asked no questions. She settled Elena into the warmest room, pressed every coin she could spare into her mistress's hands, and made her promise not to open the door for anyone wearing black and silver. Then she went back out into Dravenholm alone. The palace was not difficult to find. Nothing that large and that deliberate could hide itself. What was difficult was getting anywhere near it. The closer she walked, the thicker the crowd became, pressed in from every direction by the particular madness of a city hosting its king's mating assembly. Street vendors had appeared from nowhere, selling commemorative tokens. Groups of noble wolves moved in tight formations, the women among them dressed in extraordinary gowns that made Chloe acutely aware of her road-dusty hem and her serviceable boots, and the fact that she had never in her life looked less like someone who belonged near a royal palace. She needed to get inside. She needed to find the records office, locate the receiving officer's signature on Elena's delivery, and present it to someone with the authority to make this accusation disappear. Simple, logical, completely straightforward, except that every entrance she found was guarded by wolves in ceremonial armor who looked at her the way people look at something they are already planning to remove. She circled the palace's outer wall for 20 minutes, growing increasingly aware that she had no plan and decreasing amounts of daylight. It was the girl with the laundry basket who saved her. Young, maybe 15, moving fast along the wall's edge with the focused, invisible efficiency of palace staff, who had learned that the best way to avoid notice was to never slow down. Chloe fell into step beside her without breaking stride. "I need to get inside," Chloe said quietly. "Not the main hall. Somewhere near the records offices or the administrative wing. I have legitimate business with the palace and no patience for the front gate." The girl glanced at her sideways, sharp eyes, calculating in the way of someone who had learned early that information had value. Chloe pressed her last silver coin into the girl's palm without being asked. The girl looked at it, looked at Chloe, and jerked her chin toward a section of wall 20 yards ahead, where the stone had been worn smooth by decades of passing hands. "Servants' passage," she said simply. "Third door. It runs through the east corridor behind the ceremonial hall. Stay left, or you'll end up in the assembly." She paused. "The assembly is not somewhere you want to be tonight." "Understood," Chloe said. "Thank you." She found the third door exactly where the girl had said. The passage beyond it was narrow and low-ceilinged and smelled of tallow candles and old stone. She moved through it quickly, one hand on the wall, counting doors. She stayed left. She was almost certain she stayed left. The door at the end of the passage opened, and the sound that hit her was enormous. Voices, hundreds of them, and music, and underneath it all a tension so thick she could feel it against her skin like pressure before a storm. She had not stayed left. She stepped through the door and into the grand mating hall, and directly into the sightline of the Alpha King of Dravenholm. Chapter 3. The first thing Chloe understood was that she had made a catastrophic mistake. The second thing she understood was that there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. The grand mating hall was enormous in the way that certain things are enormous, not just in physical dimension, but in weight, in intention, in the accumulated gravity of every significant thing that had ever happened inside it. The ceiling soared somewhere above the candlelight, lost in shadow and gold. The walls were pale marble veined with silver, hung with banners that moved in a draft she couldn't find the source of. Chandeliers the size of carriages blazed overhead, throwing warm, fractured light across 500 upturned faces, across silk gowns in teal and rose and ivory, across ceremonial armor and official robes and expressions, ranging from rigid anticipation to barely concealed anxiety. Every single one of those faces was pointed toward the far end of the hall, toward him. Chloe had told herself on the long road from Ashwick that kings were just men, that power was just a story people agreed to tell each other, that whatever she found at the end of this journey, she would look at it clearly and practically, and without the kind of irrational awe that made people useless in difficult situations. She looked at Brondon Vale and revised every single one of those positions immediately. He stood on the raised dais at the hall's far end, like something the room had been specifically built to contain, tall enough that the armor across his shoulders seemed proportional rather than imposing, dark-haired, with a jaw set in lines of such absolute indifference that it read less like a mood and more like a geological feature. He was not performing coldness, he simply was cold, the way deep water is cold, the way the dark between stars is cold, not as an absence of warmth, but as a complete, sovereign state of its own. A woman stood before him, noble, clearly. Her gown was extraordinary, her posture immaculate, her hands folded with the careful stillness of someone who had rehearsed this moment extensively. She was, by any reasonable measure, beautiful. Brondon looked at her for approximately 4 seconds. Then he said something to the official at his left. 2 words, quiet, final, and looked away. The woman was escorted from the dais. Her face, as she passed the front row of onlookers, was a controlled mask with something shattered, just barely visible, underneath it. The hall absorbed her departure in murmuring silence and immediately rearranged itself for the next presentation. Chloe counted. That was the 7th. In the time it had taken her to cross from the door to her current position, frozen against the side wall, acutely aware that she was radiating wrongness in every direction, he had dismissed 7 women without a flicker of hesitation or remorse. Leave, she told herself firmly. Find the door. Find the records office. do not stand here watching a king break women's dignity like kindling. She turned. Her heel caught the trailing edge of her hem, the same badly repaired hem that had been threatening mutiny since the second day of the road, and the floor came up to meet her with a speed that left no time for dignity or recovery. She went down hard, one knee cracking against marble, and her momentum carried her forward in a graceless, unstoppable slide that ended only when her hands hit the floor and her entire body stopped moving at something's feet, something that was wearing very expensive boots. The hall went quiet, not the anticipatory quiet of before, a different quiet, sudden and total, the kind that happens when 500 people all have the same thought at exactly the same moment. Chloe looked up. Brandon Vial looked down. Up close, his eyes were darker than she had expected. Not black. She could see now from this deeply unfortunate angle that they were a brown so deep it only resolved into color when the candlelight caught them directly. They were looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not the contempt she expected. Not amusement, though something in the set of his mouth suggested he was aware of the absurdity of the moment. Something more careful than either. Something that looked impossibly like attention. Real attention. The kind a person gives to something they weren't expecting to find. Chloe became aware, in the stretched silence of that moment, of two things simultaneously. The first was that every person in this hall was staring at her. The second was that the air between her and this man felt strange, charged in a way she had no framework for, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike, like a sound too low to hear, but present enough to feel in the back of the teeth. She didn't know what it was. From the expression flickering across Brandon Vale's face, controlled, rapidly suppressed. But there, neither, entirely, did he? Get up, he said quietly. It was not unkind. That surprised her more than anything else had. Chapter 4. She had almost made it to her feet on her own. Almost. A hand closed around her upper arm before she was fully upright. Not Brandon's hand, but a royal aide's. Identifiable by the black and silver sash across his chest and the particular grip of a man who had been given authority and mistaken it for strength. He hauled her forward and up and then kept pulling, dragging her onto the dais with the efficiency of someone removing something unpleasant from a surface that needed to stay clean. Intruder, he announced to the hall, and to Brandon specifically, with the satisfaction of a man delivering good news. Human, found in the servants' passage, without documentation or invitation. Infiltration of the royal mating assembly is punishable by— I am aware of what it is punishable by, Brandon said. He had not moved, had not looked away from Chloe since she had risen from his feet. This close to the dais, with the full weight of the hall's attention pressing down from every direction and nowhere to retreat to, she could see the details of him that distance had obscured. The faint scar along his jaw, the absolute stillness of his hands, the way he carried the authority of the room, not like something granted to him, but like something that had always simply been his, the way gravity is the Earth's. The guards to his left stepped forward in unison. The one nearest spoke with clipped ceremonial formality. Desecration of the assembly demands immediate— Brandon raised one hand, a gesture so minimal it barely qualified as movement. The guards stopped. The aide stopped. The hall stopped. Brandon looked at Chloe with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use it precisely as he chose. "Why are you here?" he said. It should have been simple to answer. It was a simple question. She had the answer, had rehearsed it, had carried it like a shield all the way from Ashwick through 4 days of bad roads and worse weather. "My mistress has been falsely accused. I have documentation. I require access to the palace records office." What came out instead was, I took a wrong turn. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, the ghost of the acknowledgement that a smile existed somewhere in the world. "A wrong turn?" he repeated. "Through a servant's passage. I was told to stay left. I believe I stayed left. Clearly, there is some disagreement on that point." "You believe you stayed left," Brandon said, "and ended up in the Royal Mating Assembly." Architecture is deceptive. The hall made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a laugh, something strangled and disbelieving that fell somewhere between the two. Nobody spoke to the Alpha King like this. The aide's grip on her arm tightened with the desperation of a man watching something go wrong in slow motion. Brandon studied her for a moment longer, then the quality of his attention shifted, sharpened, and Chloe felt it the way you feel a temperature drop, subtle, immediate, dangerous. "You are human," he said, "observant. You have no wolf blood, no noble standing, no documentation, and no invitation. You entered the most significant royal ceremony in this kingdom's calendar through a servant's wall." He tilted his head very slightly. "And your instinct, standing before me now, is to be clever." "My instinct," Chloe said, "is to point out that I came to this palace for legitimate business that has nothing to do with your ceremony. I have receipts that will clear my mistress's name in under 10 minutes if someone with actual authority would agree to look at them instead of performing outrage at me. Legitimate business." He said it the way one might say interesting weather, observationally, without investment. A human seamstress's girl from a border village has legitimate business with the crown. Her mistress does, yes, and you came in her place. She's 63, and the road is 4 days. How devoted. His voice had not changed in volume or temperature, but something in it had shifted, a precision entering it, a quality of deliberate aim. "Tell me, does devotion typically walk a human girl through royal passages she was not invited into, past guards she evaded, into ceremonies she has no right to witness? Or is that particular brand of recklessness something you arrived with naturally?" The hall was absolutely silent. Chloe felt the words land the way they were intended to, not as an insult, but as a dissection, clean and methodical, each one placed to reduce her to exactly what he wanted the room to see: a trespasser, a fool, a small, presumptuous human girl who had wandered into spaces built for creatures larger than herself and confused her own stubbornness for significance. It was the most precisely cruel thing anyone had ever said to her. And it worked. She felt it work, felt the heat rise in her face, and the sudden, horrible sting behind her eyes that she refused, absolutely refused, to let become anything visible. She thought of Elena, white-faced and shaking on her shop stool. 63 years of careful work and honest living, reduced to a fabricated accusation by men exactly like the ones in this room. Men who had decided that power meant never having to be questioned by anyone smaller than themselves. She looked at Brandon Vial, at his absolute armored certainty, at the indifferent ease with which he had just tried to make her feel worthless. And something in her chest stopped being afraid and started being something else entirely. I think, Chloe said very quietly, that you have stood in this hall for 6 years, dismissing women like they are inventory you have not yet found a use for. Her voice did not shake. She was distantly amazed by that. I think that whatever you are looking for, you have decided nothing and no one in this room is worth the effort of actually seeing. And I think that a king who looks at people that way, who reduces everyone who stands before him to something manageable and dismissible, is not a great king. He is just a lonely one who has confused cruelty for standards. The silence was absolute. Brondon Vial looked at her. His reply, when it came, was quiet and perfectly aimed. And what would a human girl from a border village know about kings? Her hand moved before her mind did. The crack of the slap rang through the grand mating hall like a bell struck clean. And the world, for one suspended, breathless, irreversible moment, stopped entirely. Chapter 5. Nobody moved. That was the thing Chloe would remember afterward. Not the sound of the slap, not the eruption of voices that followed it, not the guards surging forward, or the aide making a sound like a man whose entire understanding of the world had just been restructured without his consent. What she would remember was the half-second before all of that, when the hall held its breath and Brondon Val stood completely still, with his head turned from the force of the blow, and 500 wolves waited to find out what happened when the unthinkable became real. Then he spoke 2 words, and the chaos stopped. Leave us. Not loudly. He never seemed to need loudness. The words landed with the particular weight of a man who had never once in his life had to repeat himself, and the hall responded the way it always responded to him, immediately, completely, without question. Guards stepped back. The aide released her arm as though it had burned him. The noble women were ushered toward the side doors in a rustling, murmuring tide of silk and barely contained hysteria. Within 2 minutes, the grand mating hall was empty except for the 2 of them. Brondon had still not looked at her directly. Then he turned, clasped his hands behind his back, and said simply, "Come," and walked toward a door at the far end of the dais that Chloe was fairly certain had not been visible a moment ago. She should not have followed him. Every reasonable instinct she possessed told her clearly and firmly that following the man she had just slapped into an unknown part of an unknown palace was not a survivable decision. She followed him. The eastern wing announced itself differently from the rest of the palace. Quieter, warmer, with the particular quality of air in spaces that are lived in rather than performed in. The corridors here were narrower, the stone darker, the wall sconces burning lower and steadier, without the drama of the ceremonial halls. It smelled like wood smoke and aged paper, and something underneath both that she couldn't name, something that made the base of her skull feel warm in a way she actively chose not to examine. He opened a door at the end of the last corridor and stood aside. The room beyond was large and firelit, bookshelves along 2 walls, a desk buried in maps and correspondence, 2 chairs angled toward a hearth, where a fire had clearly been burning for hours. It looked startlingly like a room where someone actually lived. Thought existed outside the performance of being a king. Chloe walked in, heard the door close behind her, turned. Brondon had moved to the desk and was looking at something on its surface with his back partially toward her, his armor catching the firelight and shifting, planes of dark gold. "You're not taking me to the dungeons," Chloe said. "No." "Why?" He didn't answer. "Why this wing? Where are we? Why did you clear the hall, and why are we— Sit down, he said. I would rather stand and have answers. He turned then and looked at her with an expression that had shed some of its court composure. Not much, but enough to show the edges of something working underneath it. Something that looked like a man solving a problem he hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely sure he wanted solved. You are in the eastern wing, he said, because it is the one part of this palace where no one enters without my direct permission. You are here because the alternative was leaving you in that hall, and the hall is no longer safe for you. He paused. That is all I will say on the matter. That is almost nothing on the matter. Yes. Chloe stared at him. He looked back at her with the infuriating composure of a man who had decided how much of himself he was, willing to offer and had absolutely no intention of being moved past that line. She sat down, not because he had told her to, because her legs, she realized, had been making a case for it since approximately the moment she had slapped a king and gotten away with it. The fire crackled between them. Outside the narrow windows, Dravenholm made its distant city sounds, voices, wheels on stone, the occasional low bell from somewhere in the palace's deeper architecture. You said the hall is no longer safe for me, Chloe said. Why? Because you struck me in front of my court. You said something that deserved it. Something crossed his face, there and gone, too fast to name. That is not the point. Then what is? He moved toward the desk, reaching across its surface for a map she couldn't see the details of from her chair, and his hand landed on hers. Neither of them had seen it coming. The contact lasted less than a second. He pulled back, she pulled back, and in the space, between the touch and the separation, something happened that Chloe had no language for. A current, a recognition, a sensation like every nerve in her hand had simultaneously become aware of itself. The fire popped loudly in the silence. Brandon was very still, looking at his own hand with an expression she had never seen on a person's face before. The expression of someone recalculating everything. She looked at hers. What? She said carefully. Was that? He didn't answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice was quieter than she had yet heard it. Something, Brandon said, that should not be possible. Chapter 6. The dinner had been Brandon's idea, which meant it was not really a dinner. Chloe understood this approximately 4 minutes into the affair, when she looked down the length of the table at the assembled court officials and noble representatives, and read their faces the way she had learned, growing up in a village full of people who wanted things from Elena's shop, to read the faces of people who wanted things. None of them wanted food. They wanted information. They wanted to know what she was, what she meant, what the Alpha King intended to do with a human girl he had moved into the Eastern Wing instead of the dungeons, and whether any of it represented an opportunity or a threat. It represented both, she suspected. She kept that thought behind her eyes and reached for her water. The table was extraordinary. Long enough to seat 30, set with silver plate and crystal that caught the candlelight and threw it in every direction, laden with more food than Chloe had seen assembled in one place in her entire life. Under different circumstances, she would have found it overwhelming. Under these circumstances, she found it useful, because having things to look at meant she did not have to look at Brandon, who was seated at the table's head to her left, and had been looking at her. She was fairly certain, for the better part of the last 20 minutes with the focused attention of a man working through a problem he had not yet named aloud. She was the problem, She was aware of this. A servant moved along the table refilling goblets, wine, deep red, in crystal so thin it was nearly invisible. When he reached Chloe, he poured with practiced efficiency and moved on. She watched the candlelight move through the liquid for a moment, then reached for it. She had the goblet 2 inches from her lips when Brondon's hand came across the table. He did not grab her. His fingers closed around the stem of the goblet just below hers and simply stopped it. Held it exactly where it was, between the table and her mouth, with a pressure that was not forceful, but was absolutely immovable. She looked at him. His eyes were not on her. They were moving down the table with a slow, deliberate precision, cataloging faces with the systematic patience of a man who was not searching so much as confirming something he had already found. When they stopped on the royal aide. The same broad-shouldered man who had hauled Chloe onto the dais in the mating hall, now seated 3 places down on the opposite side, who had gone very still in the particular way of someone trying to appear completely natural. Brondon set the goblet down. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He simply said, across the width and noise of a 30-seat formal dinner, in a tone as quiet and even as a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath, "Aldrich." The table went silent. The aide, Aldrich, looked up with an expression of prepared innocence that lasted approximately as long as it took Brondon's eyes to reach his. "Clear the room," Brondon said. It took 90 seconds. Chloe had never watched a room empty that quickly. Officials and nobles and servants flowing toward the doors with the controlled urgency of people who understood, at a fundamental level, that the only safe place was somewhere else. The doors closed. The candles guttered in the draft of their departure and steadied. 3 people remained. Brondon, Chloe, and Aldrich, who was still seated, but had developed a quality of stillness that had moved past composure into something closer to held breath. Brondon looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "The goblet," he said finally, was poured from a separate carafe. I could smell the difference from the head of the table. Another pause. "Who gave you the carafe, Aldrich?" "Your Majesty, I don't know what—" "Who gave you the carafe?" It was not louder, it was quieter. That was the thing Chloe was beginning to understand about Brondon Vale. The more dangerous he became, the less space his voice took up, as though fury for him was not an expansion, but a compression, a drawing inward of force that made the air around him feel denser. Aldrich broke in under 4 minutes. Chloe watched it happen and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the night air coming. Through the high windows, she had thought, in the mating hall, that she understood what Brondon was. A king, powerful, cold, the kind of man who wielded authority like a blunt instrument. She had been wrong. What he was, she understood now, was precise. He did not use more than he needed. He did not threaten where a question would accomplish more. He simply kept his eyes on Aldrich and his voice low and his patience absolute. And that patience, she realized, was the most frightening thing in the room, because it communicated with perfect clarity that he had no doubt whatsoever about the outcome. He was not trying to break the aide. He was simply waiting for the breaking that was already inevitable. Aldrich gave him a name. Brondon nodded once as though receiving confirmation of something expected rather than a revelation, and dismissed the aide with 2 words and a look that suggested Aldrich's position in the palace had just undergone a significant and permanent reorganization. The doors closed again. The silence that followed was the particular silence of aftermath, heavy and rearranged, the air still carrying the shape of what had just happened. Chloe looked at the goblet sitting innocuously on the table between them, and thought about the 2 inches between it and her lips, and felt, for the first time since entering Dravenholm, the specific cold of understanding that this was not a bureaucratic inconvenience she had walked into. Someone had tried to kill her on her first night in the palace, before she had done anything except fall at a king's feet and slap him and be moved to a wing of the palace she wasn't supposed to be in. "I would have drunk it," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I have no wolf senses. I wouldn't have known." "No," Brandon said. "You wouldn't have. You knew immediately. The moment it was poured." She looked at him across the candlelit table, the planes of his face in shadow and gold, the absolute composure that she now understood was not indifference, but something more like the surface of very deep water. Controlled, intentional, and underneath it, she was beginning to suspect something considerably less still. "That frightens me," she said honestly. "What you just did to that man, how easy it was for you." Brandon held her gaze without flinching. "Good," he said. "You should know what I am capable of." The honest answer, the one she kept entirely behind her eyes, was the thing that frightened her most of all. She did know now, and it did not frighten her nearly enough. Chapter 7. She appeared the following morning like weather, inevitable, elegant, and carrying the particular charge of something that intended to do damage. Chloe was in the Eastern Wing's narrow library, ostensibly reviewing the documentation she had brought from Ashwick, but actually constructing, for the 4th time, the series of decisions that had led her to this specific chair in this specific palace, when the door opened without a knock. The woman who entered did not knock the way the sun does not knock, because it had simply never occurred to her that anything in any room might not be ready to receive her. Lady Saravine was silver-haired in the way that certain women are silver-haired, not as age, not as fading, but as deliberate and absolute as a declaration. She was dressed in white so pure it made the library's warm tones look apologetic, and she moved across the room with the unhurried grace of someone who had spent decades understanding that controlled movement communicated more power than any hurried one ever could. Her face was extraordinary, sharp-boned, symmetrical, carrying the specific beauty of things that have been precisely maintained. She looked at Chloe the way a chess player looks at a piece that has appeared on the board unexpectedly. Not alarmed, not threatened, simply recalculating. She sat down in the chair across from Chloe without being invited, and folded her hands in her lap and smiled. It was the smile that told Chloe everything. Not cruel enough to be called cruel, not warm enough to be called anything else. A blade so sharp it presented as smooth. "You must be the human girl," Saravine said pleasantly. "And you must be someone who opens doors without knocking," Chloe said. Something moved behind Saravine's eyes. Appreciation, possibly, or the recalibration that comes from finding a target more alert than anticipated. "I am Lady Saravine Aldrath," she said, as though the name itself was a kind of argument. "I have served this court for 11 years. I knew Brandon's father. I have advised 3 of the 4 noble houses that control the majority of this kingdom's eastern territories." She paused. "I am telling you this not to impress you, but to ensure that what I say next is received with the appropriate weight. I'm listening, Chloe said. I know you are. That's what makes you interesting. Saravine tilted her head, slightly. You are aware, I assume, that your presence here is not simply irregular. It is, from a legal standpoint, actionable. Chloe said nothing. The blood right statute, Saravine continued, with the calm specificity of someone who had prepared this speech carefully and was now delivering it at exactly the right pace, is among the oldest laws in Dravenholm's codex. It predates the current royal line by 2 centuries. It states, without ambiguity, that any unbonded human found within the boundaries of a royal mating assembly, having entered without invitation, documentation, or noble sponsorship, may be formally challenged by any wolf of noble standing. She smoothed an invisible crease from her sleeve. The challenged human must then face the blood rite within 5 days of the formal challenge being invoked. Chloe kept her face very still. And what does the blood rite involve? It involves, Saravine said gently, surviving something most wolves don't. The fire crackled. Outside the narrow window, the palace went about its mourning with complete indifference to the conversation happening in this room. The challenge window, Saravine continued, opened the moment you stepped through that door into the assembly. It remains open for 72 hours from last night's dinner. She stood, smoothing her skirts with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had accomplished what she came to accomplish. I have not yet decided whether to invoke it. I wanted to meet you first. She looked at Chloe with something that might, in different circumstances, have been genuine curiosity. I wanted to see if you were worth the paperwork. She left without waiting for a response. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click that was somehow worse than a slam. Chloe sat with Elena's receipts in her hands for a long moment, looking at the closed door, doing the arithmetic of 72 hours, and blood rites, and a woman who had just told her she might die, here with the pleasant efficiency of someone discussing weather. She found Brondon in the map room 20 minutes later and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, standing with his back to her at the room's high window, one hand braced against the stone frame. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she began to wonder if she needed to repeat herself. Then he turned from the window and walked past her toward the door. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To call a full court assembly," he said. "To do what?" He stopped in the doorway and looked back at her with an expression she was learning to read, the one that appeared in the narrow space between his composure and whatever burned underneath it, the one that looked like decision made and consequence accepted and not a single step backward. "To make it impossible," Brondon said, "for anyone in this kingdom to invoke that statute against you." The full court assembled within the hour. Chloe stood to his left on the dais. She had not been asked. She had simply been told to stand there in a tone that left no room for negotiation, and watched 500 wolves arrange themselves in the grand hall below, and felt the specific quality of their attention like pressure against her skin. Not hostile, exactly. Something more complex than that. The attention of people watching a structure they have built their entire lives inside begin to show cracks they cannot yet determine are catastrophic or survivable. Brondon spoke for less than 2 minutes. He did not explain. He did not justify. He stated, in the same quiet, immovable voice he used for everything, that Chloe Wren of Ashwick was under his personal and sovereign protection, that any challenge invoked against her would be treated as a challenge invoked against the crown, and that he was invoking the ancient right of mate claim on her behalf before this court as formal witness. The hall fractured like ice under pressure, not all at once, but in a spreading pattern, cracks running from the center outward, noble house against noble house, voices rising over voices in a wave of outrage and disbelief that built until it was nearly a physical thing. Through all of it, Chloe stood on the dais and did not move, and across the hall, in the third row of the noble assembly, Lady Saravine stood perfectly still with her hands folded and her expression unchanged, and her eyes fixed on Chloe with a look that had moved past recalculation into something older and quieter and considerably more dangerous. She had not invoked the statute. She did not need to, Chloe realized. She had simply come to Chloe's room that morning to find out if she was worth the paperwork. Apparently, the answer was yes. Chapter 8. The advisor's name was Corvin, and he was the oldest living thing in Dravenholm that was not made of stone. Chloe could not have said precisely how she knew this. He carried no obvious markers of extreme age, no trembling hands or clouded eyes. It was something else. The way he moved through the eastern wing's lower corridor as though he had memorized it before the current floor stones were laid. The way Brondon, who deferred to nothing she had yet observed, stepped back slightly when Corvin entered the room. The way the air around the old wolf seemed to carry the specific weight of someone who had watched enough history accumulate to stop being surprised by it. He was carrying a box. Dark wood, banded with tarnished silver, the kind of container that communicates its own significance without requiring explanation. He set it on the map table with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something that had survived a very long time by being handled correctly, and intended it to survive considerably longer. "Sit," he said to both of them, with the tranquil authority of a man who had outlived every hierarchy he'd ever operated inside and now answered primarily to himself. They sat. Corvin opened the box without ceremony and withdrew a scroll so old that Chloe instinctively held her breath, as though the movement of air might be enough to begin its dissolution. It was not paper, some kind of treated skin, she thought, pale and dense, covered edge to edge in script so small and so old that the characters had begun to blur at their edges, bleeding slightly into the material that held them. "I have served this bloodline for 51 years, Corvin said, unrolling the scroll with practiced hands. "And I have shown this text to no one, not to Brondon's father, not to the council, not to the assembled noble houses who have spent the better part of a decade attempting to determine why the Alpha King cannot be moved to choose a mate." He looked up, and his eyes, pale gray, still sharp, carrying the particular clarity of someone who had shed every illusion he'd ever had, and found the view improved, moved between Brondon and Chloe with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite relief. Something between the two. Something that looked like the face of a man watching a very long calculation finally resolve. "I did not show it to them because it would not have been relevant. It is relevant now." He turned the scroll so they could both see it and placed one aged finger beneath a passage near its center. "The unmarked thread," he said quietly. "Once in a bloodline's history, not twice, not as exception. Once, written into the lineage at its origin, waiting for the generation in which the alpha's bond crosses the species line. He read slowly, his finger moving beneath each word. It will choose a human heart, one that carries no wolf scent. He paused. But holds the kingdom's fate in its uncalloused hands. The map room held the silence. Brandon was looking at the scroll with an expression Chloe had not seen on him before. Not the composure, not the cold deliberateness, not the focused precision of the interrogation room. Something stripped of all of that. A man looking at something that explained the last 6 years of his life and finding the explanation both more and less bearable than the uncertainty had been. Chloe looked at the words and thought about her hands, seamstress's hands, practically calloused from needle and frame and bolt of cloth, and almost said something and didn't. There is a second property of the thread, Corvin said. He looked at Chloe directly. If you would both place your hands on the text. Why? Chloe asked. Because the prophecy is not merely read, Corvin said simply. It is confirmed. She looked at Brandon. He looked at her. Something passed between them in that look that they had not yet developed the language for. An acknowledgement, a question, an answer to the question. They placed their hands on the scroll at the same moment. The vision arrived without transition. No warning, no build, no slow gathering of sensation. One moment, she was in the map room with firelight and old paper under her palm, and the next, she was somewhere else entirely. A forest. Dark, not the darkness of night, but the darkness of depth, of ancient growth, of trees so tall their canopy had replaced the sky. Silver light came from somewhere sourceless, falling in shafts between the trunks, and illuminating, in the clearing at the forest's center, a crown. Silver, resting on nothing, and then not resting, shattering, slowly and completely, each fragment catching the sourceless light as it fell, and the pieces did not hit the ground so much as dissolve, absorbed into the forest floor like water into dark soil, and in the center of it, where the crown had been, Chloe, herself, standing with her hands at her sides and her feet bare against the dark earth and her face turned upward toward whatever passed for sky in this place, her expression not triumphant, not afraid, simply present, simply whole, as though she had always been exactly here in this forest at this center, and everything before had been the journey toward it. Then Brandon was there too, beside her in the vision, not in armor, not carrying the weight of a court or a title, or 6 years of inexplicable isolation. Just himself, looking at the space where the crown had shattered, and then looking at her the way a man looks at something that has restructured his understanding of what was possible. The vision released it them. The map room reassembled itself around her. The fire, the table, the old scroll beneath her hand, Corvin standing across from them, with his arms folded and the expression of a man watching the conclusion of something he had been patiently waiting to see for 51 years. Chloe became aware that she was still breathing, that her hand was still on the scroll, that Brandon's hand was directly beside hers, close enough that the edges of their fingers were almost touching, and neither of them had moved. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. The fire settled in the hearth with a quiet domestic sound that was almost absurd in the context of what had just happened. Corvin gathered the scroll with careful hands and returned it to its box without speaking. He closed the lid. He picked it up. He walked to the door and paused there with his back to them and said, without turning around, The thread does not choose incorrectly. It never has. He left. The room was very quiet. Outside, Dravenholm continued its evening. Distant bells, distant voices, the ordinary, persistent noise of a city that did not yet know what had just been confirmed in a small, fire-lit room in its eastern palace wing. Chloe looked at the table where the scroll had been. Brondon looked at the same table. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Chapter 9. Saravine filed the paperwork at midnight. Chloe learned this the way she learned most things in Dravenholm. Too late to prevent it, and too early to have recovered from the last disaster. Corvin came to her door in the eastern wing before dawn with his box under his arm and his grey eyes carrying the specific weight of a man delivering news he had hoped would not become necessary, and told her in plain, quiet language that the blood right challenge had been formally invoked and registered with the Royal Codex before Brondon's mate claim could be processed through the correct legal channels. 1 night. Saravine had needed 1 night. The claim processing requires 72 hours under standard procedure, Corvin said. The challenge was filed within the window. By the letter of the law, it supersedes the claim until the right is concluded. And Brondon? Chloe asked. Is currently being held in legal conference with the council, who are ensuring he does not do anything that constitutes a sovereign override of ancient codex law. Corvin paused. Lady Saravine anticipated that response also? Chloe stood at her window and looked at the pre-dawn dark of Dravenholm for a long moment and thought about Elena in the inn, 2 streets from the outer gate, and thought about the scroll and the shattering crown, and herself standing at the center of a dark forest, looking upward, and thought about the specific quality of Brondon's expression when he had knelt beside the map table in the aftermath of the vision and said nothing because there was nothing sufficient to say. She picked up her coat. Then I suppose, she said, we should not keep the arena waiting. The arena was older than the palace. A circular pit of dark stone sunk into the earth behind the eastern wall, its galleries tiered and open to the sky, currently filling in the grey pre-dawn light with wolves who had been woken by the news and come anyway. They lined the upper tiers in silence, noble and common alike, their breath misting in the cold morning air. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to be waiting. Chloe was escorted to the arena floor by 2 guards who had the grace to look uncomfortable about it. The floor was packed earth, dark and cold, worn smooth by centuries of use she did not want to think about too specifically. The walls around her rose 20 feet, smooth stone, no handholds, no exits except the 2 iron-gated doors set opposite each other at the arena's far ends. One door had brought her in, the other one she was told nothing about. She stood in the center of the floor and looked up at the gathered court and found, in the front tier, Lady Saravine, white-gowned, composed, her silver hair immaculate in the early light, watching with the patient attention of a woman who had planned something extensively, and was now waiting to observe it concluded. Chloe looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned away and faced the second door. The mechanism that released it was somewhere underground. She heard it before she saw the result, a deep, resonant thunk of ancient machinery engaging, and then the iron gate rose and the thing inside came out, and the galleries above her made a sound she felt in her chest before she processed it as human voices reacting to something that warranted reacting to. The execution beast was enormous. That was the first thing. It moved like a wolf, but had been made into something beyond that, enchanted, constructed, assembled from old magic and older intent into a form that had been specifically designed to be unbeatable. It was easily twice her height at the shoulder. Its eyes burned with a silver-white light that had nothing to do with life and everything to do with purpose. The ground vibrated slightly with each step it took toward her. Chloe had no weapon, no wolf senses, no strength beyond her own. She ran, not away from it, laterally, cutting hard left as it lunged and feeling the displaced air of its passing against her right side like a wall of pressure. She had watched wolves move in the corridors of this palace for 4 days, and she had noted, the way she noted everything, that size and speed existed in a specific relationship with turning. The beast was both. It was not, she had approximately 4 seconds to confirm, agile. She used the 4 seconds. She ran toward the wall, planted her foot against the stone at full stride, and pushed off sideways as the beast crashed into the place she had just been. Stone cracked. The gallery above gasped. She hit the ground rolling, came up with a fistful of dark arena earth, and threw it directly into the silver-burning eyes as the beast swung toward her. It recoiled, not in pain. She did not think it felt pain. In recalibration. Even enchanted things, apparently, did not enjoy dirt in their eyes. She had bought herself perhaps 30 seconds. She was calculating what to do with them when she heard the mechanism again. The second gate, her gate, the one she had come through, rose. Brondon walked in, no armor, no ceremonial standard, no guard at his back or title preceding him. He was wearing what she had first seen him in beneath the court regalia, plain, dark clothing, boots worn enough to have seen actual use, his long black hair loose around his shoulders. He looked like a man who had walked out of a legal conference in the middle of whatever argument was being made and simply left. He looked at her first, checking. His eyes moved over her with rapid, specific attention, cataloging, confirming. And when he had established that she was upright and functioning, he shifted his focus to the beast, and his expression completed its transition into something very simple and very clear. He moved to her side. "You're supposed to be in conference with the council," Chloe said. "I left. They'll say you violated the codex. They'll say many things." He was watching the beast circle them, his body already angled into the specific readiness she had seen in him once before, in the interrogation room when he had reduced Aldrich to confession through patience alone. The same compression, the same absolute certainty of outcome. "They won't say it to my face. You could lose the throne over this." "I know. Brondon." "Chloe." He said her name with the same quiet weight he gave everything, and glanced at her sideways, and there was something in that glance that contained the scroll and the vision and the dark forest, and every half-finished conversation they had not yet had. "We can discuss the legal implications afterward." The beast lunged. What followed was not elegant. It was not the choreographed combat of the songs that would eventually be written about it. It was fast and close and brutally physical, driven by the specific intelligence of 2 people who had spent 4 days learning, involuntarily, irritably, reluctantly, how the other moved. Chloe pulled it left when Brondon needed it left. Brondon drove it back when it had her cornered against the wall. She used the earth and the angles and the merciless, practical intelligence of someone who had never had the luxury of strength and had therefore spent 19 years developing everything else, He used everything that he was: power, speed, the wolf instincts that she lacked, and he had never needed to think about before because he had never needed to coordinate them with someone who didn't share them. They brought it down together. The arena floor shook with the impact. The enchantment left the beast's eyes in a single pulse of fading silver light. And then it was still, and the dust it had raised in its falling settled slowly around them in the early morning air, and the galleries above were completely, totally, profoundly silent. Chloe stood in the center of the arena floor, breathing hard, her coat torn at the shoulder, her boots caked in dark earth, her hands at her sides, alive, functional, still herself. Brandon turned toward her, and then in front of the assembled court of Dravenholm, in the dust of the Blood-Right arena, with no ceremony and no official and no precedent for what he was about to do. The Alpha King of Dravenholm went down on one knee. The galleries made no sound. He was not looking at them. He was looking at her, only at her, with the expression she had first seen in the half-second after the slap, when she had cracked through 6 years of iron composure and found something human and real and waiting underneath it. The expression that had no name in the court's vocabulary because the court had never seen it on his face before. Recognition, certainty, something that had finally stopped being contained. Chloe looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and put 2 fingers under his chin and tilted his face upward, and said, in a voice that carried in the silence the way the slap had carried, clearly, completely, to every tear, "Kings don't kneel." Brandon looked up at her. "This one does," he said. He reached up and removed the circlet from his own head. Plain silver, worn, the everyday crown of a working king rather than the ceremonial weight of state occasions. And he held it for a moment in both hands, with the deliberateness of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and had made his peace with every consequence of it. Then he placed it on her head, not on a throne, not at an altar. In the dust of an arena, in the early morning light, in front of a kingdom that had no framework for what it was witnessing, and would spend the next generation building one. The circlet settled against Chloe Wren's braided hair. She did not cry. She did not make a speech. She did not look at Saravine in the front tier, or the fractured noble houses, or the officials who were already beginning to talk among themselves about procedure and precedent, and the 17 ways this morning was legally unprecedented. She looked at Brandon, who was rising from his knee, and looking back at her with an expression that was, for the first time since she had fallen at his feet in the grand mating hall, entirely uncomplicated. "I still need someone to look at Elena's receipts," she said. Something happened to his face that she suspected, from the sound it produced in the galleries above them, was a smile. Dravenholm had its queen. She had come for paperwork. She had stayed for something the ancient wolves had always known was coming. Written into the bloodline before the current palace was built, waiting with the patience of old things for the generation that would finally make it real. The unmarked thread had chosen. It had not chosen wrong. 3 months after the Blood-Right, Elena's shop got a new sign. Gold letters, properly painted, twice the size of the old ones, commissioned by royal order and installed by 2 palace craftsmen who had made the 4-day journey to Ashwick without complaint because the Queen had asked. Elena stood in the road, watching them work with tears running unchecked down her face. Chloe stood beside her and said nothing, because some moments do not need Words, and she had always known the difference. The charges had been dropped within a week. The receiving officer who had lost the delivery records was reassigned to the kingdom's northernmost outpost. Aldrich did not fare better. Lady Seravine presented herself at the throne room 30 days after the coronation, with a formal letter of allegiance and the expression of a woman intelligent enough to recognize when adaptation was the only remaining move. Chloe received her without warmth and without hostility, and with the absolute clarity of someone who had not forgotten a single word of a library conversation and did not intend to. The kingdom did not transform overnight. Real transformations never do. But things shifted, the way water shifts rock, slowly and with absolute certainty. Border villages found their grievances reaching ears that mattered. Human merchants found the city gates a little less hostile. The noble houses grumbled and found their grumbling returned to them as policy, shaped by a queen who had never forgotten what it cost a person to be dismissed by those with power over them. Because that is what this story was always truly about. Not the slap, not the bond, not the ancient prophecy. It was about what happens when someone told their entire life that they are too small, too ordinary, too human for the rooms that matter. Walks into one anyway, and refuses to leave. You do not need to be the most powerful person in the room. You need to be the most honest one. The rest has a way of following. If this story moved you, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Because the next story is already coming, and it begins exactly the way the best ones always do, with one moment that changes everything. Don't miss it.